Okay, in the new nation, the states are experimenting with Republican-style governments. Most all 13 of the states establish new constitutions that give legislative representative governments most of the power in governing them. Okay, so for the states as a unified entity, now they are kind of experimenting with a federal system, something that unifies them together. They're unified under the Articles of Confederation, and we'll get to that in just a second. These colonies transition to statehoods and become self-governing entities, and they all agree, all 13 of these different states agree that republicanism is the best form of government for them. Republicanism being the voting people in those who are eligible to vote to elect representatives to make laws for them. And the legislative branches are the most powerful branches of all of those state governments. Let's talk really quickly about voting requirements for these states. Most all of the states require property ownership as a prerequisite for voting. So people who do not own land and who are not educated are most often disenfranchised. Most of them do not participate in the Republican process. And we talked about republicanism, what that is. It's a type of government that's based on the consent of the people through a representative form, electing an individual to make those laws for them. These state constitutions are established on Enlightenment principles of separation of powers. Montesquieu, the Enlightenment thinker, talked about separating powers so that no one entity could encroach and become all-powerful. So almost all of them have a judicial branch, a legislative branch, and an executive branch, so that the powers of government are separated into various entities. Mentioned earlier that mostly white males that are landowners are voting throughout America. The states are responsible for making their own laws about voting laws. Okay, now the Continental Congress, we mentioned already that the Second Continental Congress is the lawmaking entity even through the first decade of the nation in the 1780s. They debated over whether or not to allow representation by population or equal representation, and they determined on equal representation. So in their new federal system, which kind of loosely joined them together as friends, they were allegiances under that new federal system, they each had one vote. In order to pass any law, they had to agree unanimously, which is going to be very difficult, and so we're not going to get a lot of legislation done. This new federal government was extremely limited, so limited that it was impaired. There was no president in the early years of the nation. There was no federal court system. States had their own court systems, but there was no federal court system. There was no federal army or national army. States had militia, but the national government did not. And the federal government did not have the power to tax, which means it didn't have money, which made it very difficult really to operate. P-A-C-T, the limitations of this government under the Articles of Confederation. So what could the Articles of Confederation do? The Articles of Confederation, they oversaw the mail. There was a lot of confusion with such a limited government. There was a lot of debate over interstate commerce, over international trade, over negotiating of treaties. But really, probably the most difficulty that the early nation had was in controlling rebellions that were still occurring. One of the successes of the Articles of Confederation was in passing two pieces of legislation. There was so much westward migration after the American Revolution that the Land Ordinance of 1785 established the system by which these western lands would be surveyed. So what states that had western land claims gave those western land claims up to the federal government. So the western frontier of like New York and Virginia and Virginia, and I said that already, and North Carolina and South Carolina, those various states, and even the western frontier of Massachusetts, they gave those lands up to the federal government, and the federal government surveyed the lands. and they were able to sell the lands to private citizens. Okay, that was the land ordinance of 1785. But this is a very Republican legislation, the next one here, and you want to know this piece. This Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is an extremely Republican legislation. It has a lot of enlightened ideas in it. This Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created a plan for 10 states to come into the Union north of the Ohio River. Now, what did you have to do in order to meet the requirements? Had to have 60,000 people. You had to have laws that funded public education. That's very important. So it recognizes the significance of an educated populace in a republic. It also forbade slavery. It made slavery illegal north of the Ohio River. Again, cementing that in a Republican nation, slavery is incongruent. But it also posed a problem with Indian relations, because it's going to, although the language of the legislation doesn't overtly declare that natives have no right to that land, it's also going to encourage encroachment and will inadvertently cause conflict with Indians as Americans encroach. Okay, so another Republican idea is that when these territories meet all the requirements for statehood, then they can submit a request to become a state, which makes them an equal participant in the federal system. So it ensures that people in the western frontier will never become second-class citizens the way that colonial Americans became second-class citizens. The people in the western frontier, when they are added as a state, will be equal participants in the federal government. There were a lot of economic problems in the early nation. The revolution had sort of created a lot of economic problems. The expansion of farms during the revolution to feed all the soldiers, and now a lot of farmers were in extreme debt. Okay, there was not really a system of handling debt. The only system was the lender would take the borrower to court, and the courts would almost always rule against the borrower, and the borrower would go to debtor's prison. A lot of these borrowers had fought in the American Revolution and felt like that they were being oppressed by taxes and oppressed by a new government that they had fought to institute. So huge economic problems. There's problems with foreign relations and like identifying who and what America is. Are these 13 separate countries, or is it one country? So there are a lot of federal issues. The problems come to a head in 1787 with Daniel Shays' rebellion in western Massachusetts. Farmers rebel against the Massachusetts government. They're going to storm Boston and attack the main city there, Boston. But they have attacked courts in the western frontier, closed down courts because the courts are ruling against the borrowers. A lot of these farmers are losing everything they have. This shows, it exposes the problem of a lack of order and a lack of proper government power to suppress these rebellions. And after Daniel Shays' rebellion, George Washington will call for a convention to create some sort of stronger federal system and something that revises the Articles of Confederation. There are a lot of opponents to this, like Thomas Jefferson. He is not for strong central government. He is actually a supporter of rebellion, being the author of the Declaration of Independence. He's super pro-rebellion. So men like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and other opponents of strong central government are going to oppose a constitutional convention. But nevertheless, a convention is called. They meet in Philadelphia, and ultimately they want to revise the Articles of Confederation. And looking at it, they decide to trash it, start over completely, and they draft a new constitution that creates a stronger federal government and unites these 13 states together in a stronger fashion. James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. He reads all these books on government before the convention, and he is given the job of drafting like the first draft of the Constitution. From the committees that are formed comes two main plans for the legislative body. There are two main drafts that are plans for the legislative body. You want to know that at the Constitutional Convention, there's a lot of compromising that goes on to create the final Constitution that creates this new federal system that emerges. The Two of the major plans you want to know. One is the Virginia plan. It favors large states. The other is the New Jersey plan that favors small states. The Virginia plan proposes a bicameral or two-part or two-house legislature. Madison drafts this plan, and the bicameral legislature would be based on population. So states with larger populations would have more representatives in this legislative branch, but then it would separate the powers into two different groups within this legislative body so that you wouldn't have so much encroaching. Okay, and then the New Jersey plan or the small state plan is just a legislature with one house or one group, and every state gets one vote. These are the two plans that emerge, and then Roger Sherman he negotiates the compromise between the two plans that proposes a bicameral house like we have today in Congress with an upper house, the legislature, that has equal representation, and a lower house, the House of Representatives, that has representation based on population. So this is called the Great Compromise. You want to know that compromises that come out of the Constitutional Convention. This is one of those compromises. And then once it's determined that the lower house will have representation based on population, then we have to do a population count or a census to determine who's going to be counted in that population. Well, southern states, they want to count their slaves so that they have the potential to have more representatives. And from that desire comes a new compromise, the 3/5 compromise. What northern states want is they want to end the international slave trade, like no purchasing slaves from Africa. That's like the first step towards a movement to abolish slavery. So Southerners agree that in 20 years we will end the international slave trade. That's one thing they give up. And they also give up their right to negotiate treaties with foreign nations. That's the Southern delegates kind of give those things up to agree to have a portion of their slave population counted in the census. So 3/5 of slave populations will be counted towards allocating representatives for the lower house. Okay, the Constitution creates a federal system, a system of shared powers between the federal government, which is the supreme governing entity. What's not written in the Constitution is then reserved for states. Okay, so that shared system of like sharing powers between the federal government or national government, you could also call it the central government, sharing powers with states, that's the federal system. If it is specifically enumerated, if it is stated, enumerated, then it is delegated to the federal government. If it's not enumerated in the Constitution, then it is reserved for states. There are some things that are concurrent powers that both the federal and state governments can do. They can both levy taxes, they can both make laws, state governments can make laws, and this system is based on separation of powers, okay, so that no one group has all the power in the federal system. You have a legislative branch that makes the laws, an executive branch that executes the laws. That's going to be the president. And then the judicial branch, they eventually give themselves the job of interpreting the law, but it's not originally in the Constitution. And then the Constitution embeds this principle of checks and balances. So each branch is kind of watching the other and making sure that they don't expand their power outside of the bounds that the Constitution has defined. And then the Constitutional Convention convenes, that meeting of delegates is over, and then commences the debate over approving or ratifying this Constitution. You're going to get those people who did not show up to the Constitutional Convention. They're going to be the leaders that oppose the ratification of the Constitution. In comes Thomas Jefferson. He's a leading anti-federalist that will oppose vehemently the approval of the Constitution. They see the Constitution as creating this new president's going to be like a king. Okay, these anti-federalists believe that power ought to be reserved for local and state governments that know the people and they know the needs of their constituency. And so big governments, they see they're going to be like the king, and they're going to be like Parliament. government. So they are opposed to that kind of government. The Federalists, on the other hand, believe that this is the best compromise for creating stability and unity within the nation. So they believe that it gives the federal government enough power, and that the people are going to be the